So thanks everyone for being here tonight. It's really a pleasure to see so many people in the audience at this event, which is sponsored by UWE Social Science in the City and the Royal Institute of Philosophy, and organized by the Bristol Festival of Ideas. I give a few plugs and comments before I start. Around you are some feedback sheets from Social Science in the City. There are some more at the front table. Please fill them in. We really want to know what you think, what we're doing right, what we're doing wrong, what we could do better. So take a few moments, fill in the sheet. It would be greatly appreciated. I've also been asked to plug tomorrow night. There's an event here on the future of Europe, also organized by Social Science in the City. You don't need a ticket. It's just turn up and get involved in the debate. So we're here to talk about automation, jobs, and basic income. The culture moves very fast. When we started planning this event, it seemed like automation, basic income, and the link between the two were really the sort of narrow domain of policy wonks, technologists, and a few weirdo philosophers. Present company excluded. Now, of course, it's on Newsnight on Tuesday. It's on the pages of our, I think we can say, right-leaning and left-leaning newspapers. It's filling the cultural space. The robots are coming to take our jobs, and basic income may provide the answer to the challenge posed by a jobless future, or so the story goes. So we thought, of course, the best thing to do would be to invite some policy experts, technologists, and a few philosophers to talk about the issue with all of you. I won't waste a lot of time with my opening remarks, so I'll just say how we're going to proceed this evening. We're going to have a short presentation in the beginning. We're going to have some responses to that presentation from our panel members, and then we're going to open it up to discussion with all of you. So let me introduce now our distinguished panel. First of all, can I introduce Sabine Hauert? You can see Sabine, can you say hello? Thank you. She's a swarm engineer. That's a great title to have. I wish that was the first thing in my bio. Swarm engineer in designing large collective systems that self-organize. And underlying all of her work is a strong involvement in science communication and online learning. And she is the founder and I think the director of RoboHub, which is a not-for-profit organization. You can visit them on the internet. They have over 1,000 blog posts and 1.5 million podcasts. Is that correct? Yeah? Downloads. Okay, 1.5 million podcast downloads. Yeah, great. So it's a great pleasure to have her here. At the end of the table, we have Tony Dyer. Tony is the Green Party candidate for the mayor of Bristol, but he's not here for that reason. His background is really in business innovation and skills, and he's worked with an organization that supported startups and small enterprises before he moved into IT training and strategy. And more recently, he ran his own consultancy working with organizations in the retail industry and the financial sector. So the impact on employment from increased automation and technological advancement has been a major theme throughout his career. Next to Tony is Dr. Matthew Studley. Matthew Studley is Senior Lecturer in Engineering and Robotics at UWE Bristol. He's also responsible for overseeing research and scholarship at the Bristol Robotics Laboratory. At the end of the table, we have Nick Srnicek and Alex Williams. They're the authors of this book, Inventing the Future, Demand Full Automation, Demand Universal Basic Income, and Demand the Future. I won't say much about them, but I'll read one sentence from their book so you can get an idea of the project that they are pursuing. Building a post-work society on the basis of fully automating the economy, reducing the working week, implementing a universal basic income, and achieving a cultural shift in the understanding of work. So just a few small things that you guys have set out to accomplish. So with that, I'll turn it over to Alex and Nick. They're going to talk about their project and their book for a little bit, and then we'll have the responses from the panel and then the discussion with all of you. Thanks very much. Nick.
So we've decided to organize this around, well, the theme of today, automation and UBI. So I'm going to speak a little bit about automation, And then Alex here will speak about UBI and what a sort of post-work world might mean today. So we begin the book, the major sort of analysis is of what is the current conjuncture of capitalism? What is going on with capitalism at the current moment? And I think we can use broadly two categories, which are, in a sense, classic Marxist categories, which have been sort of left aside for the past 50 years or so. But we can use these two categories to rethink what is going on with capitalism today. Now, the first of these is, well, automation and the increase in productivity. And the second category is this tendency towards greater and greater surplus populations. So I'm going to focus here on the first trend, which is that if you look at capitalism as an economic system, its fundamental technological dynamic is to increase productivity, what often went under the phrase of revolutionizing the means of production. And this is, from the very origins of capitalism, has been the fundamental technological aspect. So you can think about the mechanization of agriculture, the mechanization of sewing. In the 1900s, you have the rise of the assembly line. And then in the 1970s and 80s, you start to have the emergence of lean production. And each one of these sort of technological shifts involves a shift in capitalism as well. And I think that this change in the means of production is crucial to understanding capitalism. Now, I think broadly, if we discuss automation, we can sort of say there's been at least three waves already. Now, in the first wave, this is sort of when capitalism first emerges in the 1800s in Britain. And you have effectively an attack on high-skill craft labor. So a lot of what happens here is that people who are very skilled, doing very skilled labor, their jobs get broken down into smaller and smaller components, and each of those components then gets automated away with some early manufacturing. So this is sort of the first wave of automation that capitalism has undertaken. Now the second wave, it was largely low skill and largely manual labor, particularly within factories. So again, there's a sort of increase in machinery, a lot of this low skill labor gets automated, and things like the assembly line also work to automate a lot of labor. So you think about the assembly line, one of the things that it does is it means that you don't need people to be dragging goods from A to B within a factory. Instead, you have this assembly line which is doing that. So again, this is like the second wave, low skill, largely manual labor being automated by capitalism. Now simultaneously, with this, you have the rise of higher skilled jobs. So a lot of white collar work starts to emerge at this point. People involved in secretarial work, paperwork, all of this sort of stuff. But then also semi-skilled labor within factories. So if you're working on these machines, repairing them, it involves a fair amount of skill. And so actually, against the sort of traditional Marxist thesis that it's constantly de-skilling workers, in fact, capitalism has also been increasing higher skilled jobs as well. But this is, early 1900s, the first half of the 1900s, is broadly taking on low-skill manual labor. Now, what we've seen since the 1950s is something different. And in economics, it's known as the job polarization thesis. And the idea here is that a lot of semi-skilled labor, which is also middle-waged and middle-class sort of jobs, a lot of this has been automated away. Or if it's not been automated away, it's been outsourced to China and to India. So what do you see in the labor market? Well, you see the decimation of middle income and middle class sort of jobs. And what you see instead is a vast growth of low skill, low wage jobs. And you see a sort of smaller growth in high skill, high wage jobs. You can think of sort of programming as emblematic of that. But the biggest sort of change here has been the expansion of low skill jobs. And you think about, well, precarity is essentially pointing to this. And this is what automation has done over the past 40 to 50 years, has polarized the labor market. Now the issue is, well, today we have a new wave of technology. There's something different going on today. And there's numerous new technologies which are so new that they haven't even affected the economy yet. We can sort of see that they're going to massively change the economy, but we don't quite know how yet. So let me give you an example of how new this stuff is. Smartphones, the iPhone came out in 2007, so it's less than a decade old. Google self-driving cars, which I think is sort of a paradigmatic example of this new wave of technology. That project started in 2009, so it's 6 years old. And digital assistants, so Siri came out in 2011, so less than 5 years old. These are the new sort of technologies that we see emerging, and they're premised upon three different things. One is, well, a massive expansion of sensors around the world, which have allowed us to collect all sorts of new data, whether it be about the physical world or whether it be about our social relations. We have a massive new source of data within the world. The second change is we also have new machine learning, which is enabling all of this data to be analyzed and to build sort of predictive capacities on the basis of it in ways that were unthinkable 10 years ago. And then finally, we have advanced robotics. So the capacity to do very fine motor mechanisms and do other sorts of things with robotics that were not possible in the past, a decade ago. So this is the new wave of technology. It's premised upon these sort of changes. And what it threatens to do to the labor market is to affect non-routine work. Now, what is non-routine work? Well, the previous wave of technology largely affected routine work. This is work that can be explicitly codified. So you can set out in advance what it takes to actually do that task or to do that job. Today, though, technology is taking on jobs which can't be codified in advance. So I think the perfect example of this is, again, the self-driving car. There's no set of rules that you could set out in advance to sort of say exactly what you would need to do to drive a car. Instead, it relies upon some flexible thinking, some fast, flexible thinking, and this is what machine learning is very, very good at doing. So this means that the next wave of technology is going to take non-routine jobs. And largely, this is going to be low-skill, low-wage jobs, both manual and cognitive. So it threatens to possibly replace all of these sorts of jobs. So there's been a number of different estimates made. I think the most famous one was an Oxford study which looked at the US labor market, and it said that on the basis of the technologies which are coming on board, over the next 2 decades, 47% of jobs could be eliminated. Now, a similar study was done for Europe, and it suggested that in Europe, 54% of jobs could be eliminated in the next 2 decades. The Bank of England did a similar study. It suggested that 3 million jobs within the UK could be eliminated. 3 million, or may have been more than that. And then finally, a recent study that came out a few days ago in Japan suggested that 49% of jobs in Japan could be automated. So the idea here is that this technology is going to massively change our labor markets. Now, obviously, we're not going to have a 47% increase in unemployment, but there is going to be massive shifts in the labor market. So we need to start thinking about this. And I think broadly, if you look to the mainstream, you get two sort of responses. One is to say, well, if we look at history, technology has constantly been changing things, and we haven't had a rise in mass unemployment. Therefore, this will probably just be the same. We don't really need to worry about technology. Now, I think the problem is that massively misreads the history, and it's a very simple version of exactly the relationship between technology and work. So in the first case, well, previous waves of automation often went along with a reduction in the working week. And so you may have a smaller demand for labor, but at the same time, you're also decreasing the supply of labor. This just isn't happening today, though. We have no movements for a reduced working week at the present moment. Equally, we don't really have the sort of thing that you had after the World War II, a program for full employment. You have politicians talking about full employment, but they're not willing to actually do the sort of policies and investment that would actually get us down to, the unemployment rates that we had in the 1950s. Germany was below 1%. The US and the UK were below 2% unemployment. There's no sort of policies available to get that sort of job growth today. So I think the sort of perspective which looks at history and says, well, we've never had major problems before, this time will be the same, I think it misreads history. Now, the second mainstream response, is to say, well, we do need to worry about this. It is going to be a big change. We need to do something. And effectively, you see a bunch of people trying to suggest ways to get people back into work. largely this is based upon some notion of increased education. We need to give people the skills so they can move up and do higher skilled jobs, the remaining jobs that we'll have after automation hits. And so you see this, in universities. You see the university being turned into basically a form of job training rather than anything based upon, the intrinsic value of education. You also see harsher welfare policies. So the whole notion of workfare makes no sense if you think it's about getting people back into jobs. It doesn't function that way, and the sort of evidence for it suggests that it doesn't work. It does make sense, though, if you want to compel people to think that they need to get jobs and to blame themselves for not being able to get jobs. So you see these sorts of policies being proposed to constantly try and get people to move up in the labor market, to do higher skilled jobs. Now, for a variety of reasons, I don't think this will work, not least because economic growth globally has been massively sluggish since the 2008 crisis, and it doesn't seem to be about to launch off at any point soon. So I don't think trying to get people into jobs is going to work either. But I also think there's a broader set of problems that are missed if we just look at unemployment. How am I doing for time?
Okay.
Yeah, okay. So I'll go sort of quickly through these. 4 different problems that are missed by unemployment, just focusing on unemployment. The first aspect is a classic Marxist thesis. Marx pointed out that if you have a vast group of unemployed people, the power then goes to capitalists. You're able to fire a worker at will, knowing full well that you'll have a long line of people waiting outside to take that job. So a vast group of unemployed people means that capitalists, managers, bosses have more power. So what does this mean? This gets expressed as increased stress in work, longer working hours, lower wages, more temporary, precarious work, which is exactly what we have seen over the past 30 years, an increase in precarity, a decrease in the stability of jobs. And I think this is partly an expression of an increased surplus population. The second aspect is this phenomenon called jobless recoveries, which is something that didn't exist until the 1980s. And effectively what it is that after a recession, the economy starts growing, but job growth doesn't come back. Job growth takes longer to come back. And it didn't exist until the 1980s, and every recession since then, at least in the United States, has been worse and worse. So it's been a deeper job recession, but it's also taken longer and longer to get those jobs back. And effectively what this suggests to me is that capitalism just can't produce jobs at the same sort of rate that it once could. It's really struggling to do that. So jobless recoveries, I think, are also a symptom of the problems of capitalism today. Now, the third and fourth sort of symptoms of this problem are related. So this is the growth of slums within the developing world and the rise of urban marginality within developed economies. So around the world, approximately 1 billion people live in slums. And what are slums? Slums are the result of people being tossed off of the land, a subsistence economy where they could survive, being thrown into cities where A, there's not enough housing, and B, there's not enough jobs. And so 1 billion people are being forced to eke out this existence, build informal housing, and survive in informal economies. They don't have jobs. They don't have proper jobs in any sense. And so slums, I think, are another expression of the way in which globally capitalism just can't produce enough jobs to provide for these people. Now, a similar thing happens in the developed world, and this is the rise of urban marginality. It's the idea that certain sections within cities and certain groups of people, primarily racialized groups of people, are being tossed into areas where they just can't find jobs. So the ghettos of America are a fantastic example of this. If you're black in America, you're 2 times more likely to be unemployed than if you're white. And this is an expression, again, that certain groups of people are being tossed aside by capitalism and being excluded from exploitation. And a famous quote from Joan Robinson is the idea that the only thing worse than being exploited by capitalism is not to be exploited. So this is sort of what's happening, and I think this is the fundamental problem that we face over the coming decade or two of capitalism, is the production of surplus populations, the tossing aside of increasing numbers of people that have no means to get a waged job. So this is sort of the crisis of work that capitalism is producing, and that automation is going to accelerate.
Okay, so I'll jump in here. Okay, so then there's obviously a question here, which is, what is our attitude to automation? So do we welcome the robots stealing our jobs? Is there a set of conditions under which the robots stealing our jobs might not be a bad thing? This is a kind of question we try and answer in our book. So, in a certain sense, automation can be seen as a risk. It's a risk of, vast surplus populations who are no longer necessary for labour processes. But it can also be seen as an opportunity. So, one of the ways that you need to, or one of the kind of methods through which you could understand it as an opportunity is to think about what else would we have to put in place for a more highly automated society or an economy where more jobs are automated or more tasks are automated. And we have in the book a kind of a set of ideas that we think can become kind of mutually reinforcing over time. And perhaps one of the most important of these and the most kind of significantly being foregrounded in the news in the last kind of year and especially in the last week is an idea called universal basic income. So, for example, if you have automation, maybe you have a necessary reduction in the working week, we might see some benefits in this. We might see that there's more free time, but we still need to afford to be able to live. So an essential part of what we would think of as a kind of a left-wing or progressive politics of automation, so a politics of automation that's not based on just immiserating a lot of people, is a UBI. The basic idea of a UBI, universal basic income, is to give every citizen a livable amount of money without means testing. So this is an idea that's popped up throughout history, certainly the history of the 20th century. So in the early 1940s, a version of it was advanced as an alternative to the Beveridge Report that eventually helped shape the UK welfare state. In the 1960s and 70s, basic income was central to various proposals for US welfare reform. And around this period, a number of small-scale experiments were set up in Canada, the United States, and also in this period, over 1,300 economists signed a petition pushing the US Congress to enact a national system of income guarantees. 2 presidents, Nixon and Carter, attempted to pass legislation to achieve it. And interestingly, Alaska eventually implemented a basic income funded by its oil wealth, although not at a very high level. But the idea has basically kind of disappeared in recent years. Until relatively recently, and this idea has kind of undergone a resurgence in popularity. So this kind of resurgence takes a few different forms. So it's been taken up by people like Paul Krugman, Martin Wolf, the New York Times, the Financial Times, the Economist are all talking about universal basic income. The Swiss are holding a referendum on UBI. Various political parties have adopted it in their manifestos recently, including the Greens in the UK, albeit with somewhat unfortunate results when it came to be investigated. Under media pressure, there have been new experiments with it in places like Namibia and India. The idea has been promoted by groups in Brazil, South Africa, Italy, Germany, and an international network involving over 20 countries. UBI is also increasingly on the agenda precisely because of robots stealing our jobs, and it seems to be a seductive solution to that problem. Robots steal our jobs, so in some way we need to find ways that we can reproduce ourselves physically on an everyday basis without requiring an income. The demand for a UBI, however, is subject to different competing forces. So with the first one, it's fundamentally a bit like automation. It's ambiguous. So it can be mobilized towards basically a libertarian dystopia, or it can be mobilized towards other kind of more socially progressive ends. And it's interesting if you look at the history of the idea, it's been promoted both by those on the left and on the right, although the way they think about it is quite distinct. So when we talk about a UBI, we think it's going to require 3 factors for it not to be a kind of policy that's going to lead to a libertarian dystopia. 1, it's got to provide a sufficient amount of income to live on. It must be universal, provided to everyone unconditionally. And 3rd, it must be a supplement to the welfare state rather than a replacement to it. So this is an interesting point in the kind of proposals that we've seen this week coming from the Finnish government, where a lot of the debate is around what does their proposed universal basic income get rid of. So, point one, sufficient to live on. A UBI has got to be a materially adequate income for it to have any impact. So this exact amount is going to vary dependent on where you live, cost of living. The risk is if you set it too low, a UBI becomes effectively a government subsidy, often to business or to landlords. So in terms of some recent proposals, the Swiss proposal, I believe, is set up 18,220 euros per annum. It's quite a large amount. Finland has been proposing approximately 9,600 euros a year. The UK proposal, so by the Greens, and it seems the RSA, which is working on this issue at the moment, came out a lot lower, somewhere around 5,000 euros, which is quite limited unless existing benefits are retained. In addition, UBI has got to be universal, so the universal bit of it we think is non-negotiable. Otherwise, you end up kind of falling into the trap, the kind of disciplinary traps that contemporary welfare systems have. So, if UBI is dependent, for example, on behaving well, that might be highly problematic. And finally, it's got to be a supplement to the welfare state. So, the conservative argument, or the right-wing argument for a basic income, should be one that's kind of avoided. This is that you should simply replace the welfare state by providing a big chunk of money to people. On this understanding, UBI becomes a vector of increased marketisation. So basically all social services are privatised. We use our basic income to buy the ones that we like. I think this will have quite a lot of bad effects. So in some sense, UBI needs to be a supplement to the welfare state rather than a replacement. There's a vast number of reasons to support UBI, drawing on moral arguments and empirical research. So I'll list some of these. Tends to lead to reduced poverty, better public health, reduced health costs, fewer high school dropouts, reductions in petty crime, enabling people to spend more time with family and friends, less state bureaucracy, enabling more people to start their own business, and enabling more people to go back to education. And a lot of these findings have come from UBI pilot schemes that have been run in various places around the world, in both the kind of developed and developing world at different points in time. But we would like to emphasise also that the demand for a UBI, or kind of thinking that UBI might be a good idea, is a sort of a demand for a political transformation. It's not just an economic question. So it's often thought that UBI is simply a form of redistribution from the rich to the poor. I think it is to some extent, but also the real significance of UBI lies in the way that it might be used to overturn the kind of asymmetries of power that exist between, for example, workers and their employers. So a UBI, which might be necessary to be introduced because of the kind of economic impacts of automation, might be useful because if it's set at an appropriately high level, it might reduce the coercive aspects of having to sell your labour to earn money. It might decommodify labour. And partly one of the ways it would do this is by, if most people don't, or if people have to a lesser extent, sell their labour in order to survive, it's going to mean that, for example, workers have more power. It's going to be easier to withdraw your labour. It's going to be easier, for example, if you don't like your job, to not do it anymore. There seems to be an implication of a properly, fully implemented universal basic income on the terms that we kind of understand it. So this would have various benefits. For example, the amount of time spent working for a wage could be modified to one's own desire, and your free time could be spent doing things like working in your community, engaging with politics, slowing down to reflect. It would reduce a lot of the anxieties of work, which are anxieties related to the fact that you're scared to lose your job because if you do, like the implications of that might be quite bad on a personal level. It would reduce underemployment as well. So economists believe that there's a big problem in a lot of contemporary economies that people are spending a lot of time at work and they're not necessarily being that productive. This is an idea that the anthropologist David Graeber has referred to as quote-unquote bullshit jobs. So jobs that could be eliminated without any great cost to society. But I think even more important is kind of bullshit elements to jobs. So the time that we spend where we're not working, but we have to be present. A UBI in combination with automation might be set up a dynamic which would reduce that phenomenon. It also transforms precarity and insecurity into a much more kind of socially bearable flexibility. So at the moment, jobs are becoming more and more flexible because technology enables it and employers want it because it reduces their cost base. But if we had a universal basic income, there could be a form of flexibility that is more tilted in favour of workers. A basic income would also lead, I think, in combination with automation, would also kind of necessitate a rethinking of the values attributed to different kinds of work. It would also reflect the social creation of value. So one of the benefits of a UBI is that you're paying it to everybody, and it's not just because you need to do it because if you don't, no one will buy any products because no one will have any money because half the population is unemployed, according to some estimates. There's also an implicit kind of moral element to it, which is we're paying this to everybody because everybody is collectively creating value. So one of the ways you can think of this is, where has the investment come or for the research that's gone into all these kind of technologies which will lead into automation? It's often originated with the state. This is the argument of the economist Mariana Mazzucato. So there should be some kind of reward to the public for that. There's also the idea that a lot of the value we kind of create kind of in the online environment is from our data and our interactions. We're not paid for any of this. Maybe this is a way that we can be rewarded for it. Finally, a basic income is a fundamentally feminist proposal to the extent that it provides income for the work that people, and often in our society still, unfortunately, women have to do for free. So domestic labour. But an implication of all of this is that actually this kind of transition won't happen simply for economic or political reasons. It will also involve, over time, a kind of transition in the way that we think about principally the work ethic. So this is not just a question of, you know, robots will be able to do more jobs or algorithms or machine learning systems, but also, and maybe the fact that states might give us a universal basic income, so we might not have to work as much. But also there's a kind of another element is the fact that we kind of all think that or a lot of people think that there's a kind of intrinsic value in work. One of the immediate responses when you put these kinds of issues to a lot of people is, well, first of all, why would I get something for nothing? That's one. But the other thing is, what would I do with my time? So there's the work ethic has a number, is very, very useful for the kind of current setup of employment, work, labour. But it also performs a kind of emotional role in terms of it narrativizes people's lives. Like when you meet somebody at a party or a function, one of the first questions is, what do you do? And what do you do is normally, what's your job? So if people are not going to be as identified with paid labour, there's going to be a question about how do they find meaning in their lives. And I think one of the answers to this is that we need to kind of replace the work ethic as it currently stands. This is not necessarily an argument for doing nothing, but to think about what other ethics are there available. So ethics towards things like creativity or innovation. These are not intrinsically even things that are necessarily a part of the kind of system of capitalism we have today. So maybe these are kind of some of the areas in which we can start. So maybe we can talk about this more in the questions, but as we present it in the book, we think that there's, and this was mentioned by Darian in the introduction, we think that there's a kind of 4 demands which we kind of talk about. We think each of these builds and reinforces the other. So this is full automation, and full automation is a kind of speculative phenomenon. So, of course, full automation might be impossible or it might not happen immediately, but a move towards automation, combined with a reduction of the working week, combined with a universal basic income, and combined with a kind of an attempt to move away from our present work ethic. And each of these builds and reinforces on the other. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick and Alex. I think now we would love to listen to your feedback from the rest of our panel. If you want to start.
Sure. So I'm not against a basic income, but I don't agree with the premise that robots are going to steal our jobs. Being a roboticist, I do want to say that it's very difficult to make a robot, and it's very difficult to make a robot do multiple tasks. Most robots that are being developed currently are really only good at one thing, if they're good at anything at all. And just to do something like a robot vacuum cleaner takes years and years of development and takes a lot of testing, and that's one specific task, which is vacuuming. The same for the autonomous cars. That's years and years and years of development to finally be able to make a car that can drive decently on certain roads. So really this idea that we're going to be able to automate something is going to take a very long time before we can actually reach those levels. And I think the things that we are able to automate now, I'm quite excited that we're starting to see these things leave the lab and actually be useful in the real world, are things that actually I'd love to have a robot car, because frankly I'd like to be doing something else than driving on the roads. And so I like to believe that the things we're developing in the laboratories are replacing tasks that might lead to a better world for us in general. But that will displace jobs, and that's something that technology has historically always done. I think new technology does displace jobs, and then there's a lot of questions in terms of how do you train a new generation of people who can do the new jobs that are going to emerge as a result of this new type of technology. And the new technology is not just driving, it's not just specific tasks that we're used to. There's a whole new market that's being developed because of these new robotic developments. So the whole drone industry, the fact that, there's a startup at the Bristol Robotics Lab where I work that's making 3D prosthetics that you can essentially print, and that allows for a whole different market that just didn't exist before, and that we're creating because we have these new technologies. And so all these startups that are bubbling up, these are new markets, new jobs, areas where we need to train a new generation of young people. So I think these new markets also offer potential for new jobs that just didn't exist beforehand. And as we go along on this path, I think communication is key. Here you heard a lot, robots are going to steal jobs. You saw a number of headlines from the media, and there's a reason you're seeing all these headlines. This is clickbait. These are headlines that are really, really helpful for media to get the clicks all the way to the article so that you are looking at those things. And understanding where the communication comes from is really important. I think the community, the robotics community, needs to do a better job communicating what's possible, what's not possible, what the challenges are, so that there is a balanced discussion out there. And that's why these debates are so important, I think.
Yeah, I'd like to echo some of what you've said, Sabine. So, unfortunately, robots are generally quite rubbish at doing their jobs. And of course, they're getting better rapidly. But like Sabine said, the general purpose automation is a long way off. Now, we can imagine that it might at some point in the future be possible to make general purpose machines that are like idiot slaves. So, like the golem of the ancient story, you can set it to a task and it will do the task repeatedly. But to do anything more than that requires a whole load of fundamental questions to be solved. And these are hard questions, and nobody's really got a handle on them from either a developmental or philosophical angle. So where we want to move from having a robot that does some repetitive task, to a robot which is capable of understanding what it is that you want it to do, and then interpret your wishes and start doing it, this is a big change. And so far, I don't see much sign that we're making good progress towards that. But having said that, so I share your thoughts about if automation becomes ubiquitous, that a universal basic income would be very attractive. Now, my particular interest in robotics has always focused on the sort of three primary objectives. I can't remember who came out with this quote, you might know, Sabine, that robots are designed for jobs which are dull, dirty, or dangerous. And I think these are the areas which we should be seeking to automate. It's not stuff that people want to do. Ideally, it's giving us capabilities which we never had before. So particularly improving efficiency, for example, improving the efficiency in agriculture or in the protection of our environment. One of the concerns which I have with this universal automation is that I can imagine if, one libertarian approach to this would be that effectively we're all given a robot version of ourselves, and then I could send my robot off to do my job. Everybody else could send their, obviously this is a foolish example, but everybody could send their robots off to do their job and sit at home and enjoy the fruits of their robot selves' labours. But then I think the problem with this is then one me's worth of job is being done as one me's worth of job was being done before. The resources required to do that job are still being used in order to produce the output of that job. But in order to do this, we've taken a whole bunch more resources to make a robot that can do it where I used to do it. And meanwhile, I'm off consuming resources, enjoying myself in whatever way I choose, possibly on a universal basic income. So what we've done effectively is massively reduce the overall efficiency of our economy with no real gain. And I think that's a future which we should probably try to avoid.
Thank you. I hope everybody can hear me okay. Sabine mentioned about one of the possible benefits of having a robot driving your car is that you'd be able to get on with some more work. Well, I have good news. You can do that now. It's called a bus. And I think sometimes we do have this tendency to go for technology just because we can do it. Even if we could have a fully automated workforce, I don't think it would be either desirable or eventually that useful. There are some jobs where you will want a human being to be there that you can communicate with. And I'm not going to use the word or the phrase surplus population. I think a better phrase is undervalued population. There are many people doing jobs in our society, for example, care workers, who are grossly undervalued in terms of the amount of income that they are given. And in those situations, something like universal basic income that provides some extra income on top of what they're being paid at the moment would be very useful. I've been here before, over 20 years. There was a situation in the 1980s. The guys mentioned earlier on about the creation of clerical jobs from the 1950s onwards. And in the 1980s, there was the introduction of microcomputers and all this wonderful new software that was going to make it so much more efficient for us to do our clerical work on the computer. We wouldn't have to go down to wait for the mainframe computer down in the basement and then eventually get the result of what we were trying to do. We could actually just type it in on the keyboard. And what happened with those computer systems was you now got a situation where they got bigger and more powerful. And all it's changed is that instead of getting a letter which told you how much money you would, wrongly how much money you were getting, you now get the same letter telling you wrongly how much money you were getting, but it's now got pretty graphs and you've got different color schemes and so on. It's created extra work, but it's not solved the problem to begin with. So I am very concerned. I think there are some jobs which will become automated, increasingly be automated. We are seeing increasing examples of jobs being reshored, being brought back to the UK, but not creating jobs for individuals and not creating worthwhile jobs. So I understand what the guys are saying, but there's a certain amount of silicon snake oil about it. I'm not sure whether it's something we want to do for the benefit of our future society. And it would also be remiss of me not to mention universal basic income. as a Green Party politician, I have the scars in my back from when we tried to bring in the idea or the concept of a universal basic income. It was, derided by a couple of journalists even before we announced what it was going to be, which was not bad to have a policy attack before we even decided what the policy was going to be. That was a new one on me. It would have given a basic income of around about £4,200 for every person aged between 18 and 60, well, the retirement age, which keeps changing. But if you were, for example, a single parent with one child, then that would shoot up to something like €16,500, which is similar to the income that the Finnish model is. I don't know the details of the Finnish model. And it's something that we're still working on. I think we will see a basic income introduced because the number of jobs that this economy is able to create is decreasing. And I don't want to see people thrown on the scrap heap of our society. And I don't think anybody in this room does either. Thank you.
I had a question also. So I just had a couple of comments and a question maybe. My first question maybe for you guys is, what do you mean by universal? So you really stress the universality of basic income. And of course, there are different terms that get used in this debate. One is just basic income, one is universal basic income, and another is citizens' income. They all mean slightly different things. I know you guys really wanted to stress the universality of it. Does that mean all citizens, all residents? Does that include children? And maybe that's a little bit too much of a practical question, but how can that be managed in a situation where you have the free movement of people, for example, within a political body like the European Union? Would you have to then have a UBI that would be Europe-wide, in fact, if you're going to have that kind of free movement of labor? My other question has to do with the question of political power. You mentioned, in fact, that a UBI would empower the working classes. And I was curious about that because it seemed to me that the political power of the working classes was always dependent, in fact, on the capacity of slowing or even stopping the economy. And in a fully automated or a much more automated economy, that power is not going to be there anymore. In fact, the capacity to keep the economy going will no longer be on the side of the worker. So I wonder what you think about that. A final thing is, I thought it was really important that you talked a little bit about breaking the fetish of work, actually. Breaking a certain kind of fetishism around work ethic. I wonder if that might be phrased in a slightly different way, in fact, about breaking the fetishism around salaried or wage labor, in fact, and celebrating all different types of work. I know in fact, you went in that direction. But I wonder if we need to be a little bit more precise about making this distinction between a certain type of labor, a certain type of waged or salaried labor, and in fact work, which can encompass a much broader category of activities, not just domestic work, which you included, or care work, but also just things like playing, or sitting around and reading books, being in a book club or a book circle. That should be considered work as well, because it performs a certain type of social function, although it's not salaried and it's not waged. So that's my questions and comments for you guys.
Thank you. That's some excellent questions. I'll tackle this first sort of issue about, well, what can robots actually do? Will they actually take jobs? And I think it's very important to point out, as it was, that the media headlines about robots taking jobs are purposefully apocalyptic. It's not going to be as bad as they suggest, as they present it. And in fact, the studies that I cited, 47% for the US, 49% for Japan, 54% for Europe, these are all studies which explicitly don't take into account the economics of the situation and the politics of the situation, nor do they take into account the sort of new markets and new jobs that may be created as a result of it. So these are the sort of extreme cases, the extreme possibilities. Now, I think that being said, there's a useful sort of distinction to make between tasks and jobs. Now, a job is made up of a number of different tasks. And when we're talking about robots and automation, it's better to be talking about not them taking jobs, but them eliminating tasks. Now, this means that for a particular job, half the tasks that you do could potentially be automated, but you'd still have half the tasks left. Now, what this means on a personal level is, well, your job may be reconfigured, it may be changed, it may not be eliminated, but it may be changed. And this is what we've seen a lot of in recent years, especially with the personal computer and the rise of things like that. So to talk just about job elimination, I think is somewhat missing the point. It has obvious media allure, but I think it somewhat misses the point. So jobs are going to be reconfigured. The labor market is going to be upset in various ways. Will we have 50% more people unemployed? No, that's not the case. But I think this is why the other symptoms are quite important as well. So increased precarity, increased risk of jobless recoveries, and a growing size of people just completely tossed aside and left to fend for themselves in informal economies or in black market economies, in criminal economies, these sorts of things. I think those are all suggestive as well, that capitalism just can't produce enough jobs for people. Now, is that completely up to automation? Is that completely the responsibility of automation? No, I don't think so. I think we also need to look at the history of which groups of people have been historically excluded from capitalism. So women were left out of the labor market until the 1970s, 1980s, and still are to a greater degree than men. Same thing with, it's, again, racialized categories. Certain groups of people are left outside of capitalism. If you're a white male, you're much more likely to be employed than any other group. So we need to be thinking about how racism, sexism, all these sorts of things interact with automation. It's not just automation which is producing this problem of surplus populations. Don't know if you want to step in.
Yeah, so I'm not sure which questions to address here. Whatever. So I think I agree with what Nick was saying. I think also when we're thinking about the kind of new jobs which are going to be created, it's also important to think about, well, how many of those jobs are there? So there's a kind of familiar idea which politicians might talk about, which is called going up the value chain. So you lose some jobs in certain sectors, but overall, you hope that you can retrain people become more educated, and they can do higher value, more kind of creative jobs that require more kind of skill or judgment. So that's a story that's told. It's not always necessarily the case that this occurs in reality. So, for example, if you look at kind of areas of the north of England, for example, there are still whole areas that are basically there's large-scale structural unemployment, or the jobs that were created are a different kind of meniality, like instead of working in mining or some similar industry, it's working in a call center, which is dull, uninteresting work. I've done it myself. The other side of things is let's look at the big companies today. Let's look at the kind of how many people they employ. So specifically, if you look at things like the tech sector, it's totally possible to have a company which does not necessarily employ that many people being valued, and maybe these valuations are, the finance sector, maybe they're slightly speculative values. But for example, I think was it Instagram where they were valued at something like $2 billion and they employed something like 20 people. So that's a $2 billion company for only 20 people being employed by them. So this is kind of, if you generalize this, then this becomes kind of somewhat problematic. I absolutely agree that when you think about kind of jobs being automated, you shouldn't necessarily think about a robot slave that looks like a human being and is kind of running around, because of course the resources involved in that would be very problematic. But I think you can already look in a variety of jobs and see the way that certain forms of automation, which might be as much things like the use of algorithms or the use of machine learning, and often being used in conjunction with things like contracting out certain services, taking those jobs abroad. These all become part of a kind of a dynamic which enables work to be done more efficiently. So you can see this in not necessarily even menial jobs, but areas like accountancy and legal work, increasingly the kind of more routine but with some elements of judgment work. For example, in both of those areas, things like due diligence, where you have to go through a gigantic pile of paperwork to find relevant stuff. This is increasingly being automated. And this is going to take quite a lot of jobs, even in these kinds of sectors. So I think that's important to attend to. To turn to the questions at the end. So this is a question about universal. How do we manage free movement of people? So this is a especially relevant question right now. How do we do that? Well, I think there's a number of ways to approach this. There's a question about how might this be managed in practice by the current kind of governments that we have. And you could imagine it being, highly policed so as to avoid anybody that was not, perhaps instead of a basic income, it's a citizen's income, perhaps it's only for people who have been born here. I would argue that would be not necessarily a great idea for moral reasons, perhaps also for economic reasons as well. So it's important to remember also that in terms of the kind of trials of UBI, these have been done in various places. There have been some done in India, some done in Africa, some done in America, Canada, and areas of Europe. The results of them are quite interesting. So the presumption that if you give people free money, and these are often quite small-scale trials, so they might not last for that long. They might be on not a very large spatial scale, so they might be on the scale of like a small region or a city or a town. And they might often not be set at very high levels. They might be more like a kind of income supplement. But often the results of them are quite interesting. So the idea that people just sort of sit on their arses, not really doing anything, is not borne out by the majority of these trials. The majority of them suggest that people will go back to education. They'll often start small businesses. So it's not necessarily the case that they will be idle by any means. So I think there's possibly even economic benefits that are possible by saying, actually, we will have it be universal. Now, obviously, this does create problems, but these would only be a kind of extenuation of the problems that we already face. I think, and this would certainly, if our aim is not to have a kind of national universal basic income, we would ideally have this on a global level. But obviously, this would be a very long-term project indeed. Nick, do you want to turn to these? There were these.
Yeah, so I'll just make a couple other quick comments so we can open it up for more discussions. But on the issue about undervalued work, I think is exactly a very important point to point out. And the issue is also that while certain tasks, certain jobs that we do, certain labor that society requires aren't automatable in any sort of meaningful way, or if they are automatable, we wouldn't want them to be automated. I don't think most of us would want childcare to be automated. Some people may, and that's good. Good for you. But I think most of us would rather not have a robot taking care of a child. So this sort of stuff, we have to think about, well, okay, that work is going to remain, even if we had a fully automated society, which is, again, a sort of hypothetical question on every other level. And I think the issue here is that, well, something like a universal basic income, something like the reduced work in other areas, would enable society to be revaluing that sort of labor. The sort of labor that, for now, goes unpaid oftentimes, or very lowly paid, very lowly respected in other cases. So I think a post-work society enables us to start rethinking what labor we do value, how we value it, and a basic income is at least a basic recognition of the value that this sort of labor provides for society. Now, one other quick issue is the issue of political power. And you're absolutely right that traditionally the power of labor has come from withdrawing its labor from the production process, going on strike, sit-down strikes, whatever the case may be. I think the problem is assuming that we still have those sort of spots left, or assuming that they're not going to be disappearing in the near-term future. So I'll give a couple quick examples. One is the RMT in London and self-driving tubes, which Boris Johnson very explicitly wants self-driving tube cars in order to be able to undermine the power of the RMT. And I think the sort of presumption that the RMT will be able to indefinitely fend this off, I think, is wrong. The real issues here are that automation is going to lead to a reduction in the traditional sort of power points for labor. And the question is then, well, what do we do? If we can't stop it, we have to respond to it in certain ways. And I think what we need to be doing is learning from unemployed movements and from struggles around social reproduction. These are struggles which have never had a workplace to fight within, but they've still managed over the course of history to exert a lot of power. And the question is, well, how have they done that? A good example is Argentina. The unemployed movement there managed to take down a government primarily by blockading massive freeways. And this is, it's not a workplace, it's not a point of production, but it does give them a point of power and a point of leverage over capital and over the state. So I think we need to rethink how struggles operate in an automated world and not sort of presume that, these sorts of points will continue to exist.
There was one last point, which is just about breaking the fetish of work. And you were saying maybe that it needs to be a bit more precise. So, I'd sort of agree with this. I mean, it does kind of, maybe this comes down to semantics. Basically, what do we count as being work? What does work mean? Does work have to be, paid labour? I would say that certainly you would definitely want to kind of value the kind of self-directed efforts that humans make towards various tasks, both pleasurable and necessary, that aren't purely necessary just so that they can live. So yeah, when you talk about playing, reading, all of these other things, I would agree with that. So I think it might come down to semantics here, but I think it really comes down to the level of when we talk about work, we're really talking about work that you have to do in order to live.
Forced labor.
Yeah, effectively coerced labor. Yeah.
I think we would like to hear your opinion, so maybe we can open the conversation with you. And we should have a microphone. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask around there.
Thanks for a great talk, guys. The first thing I wanted to say was just a quick comment, and it seems to be based on what the robotics guys were saying about the idea or the argument that we're a long way off. That seems to be, for me, premised on the very capitalist conditions we're talking about today, i.e. deflation, 0% interest rates, and the fact of weak growth. These are all contributing to the inability for technology or infrastructure or funding to be put into the very sectors that could lead to the automation of jobs. That's just a comment. But the question I want to ask Nick and Alex was, how do we go around changing the kind of common sense or the way in which power operates at the moment, in terms of, there seems to be an emphasis on, just today in my work, talking to my boss, saying, get the customer to do the job, get them to do the work, And even we see in the day-to-day lives when we go to a supermarket now, when self-checkouts were first in place, hardly anyone used them. Now people queue to use the self-checkouts instead of actually seeing an operator. So there seems to be a way in which the workplace or the way in which business actually now kind of encourages to do our own work, to do the work that used to be done by other people. So it's just basically, how do we go around kind of changing the common sense approach?
Yeah, I think they're really good questions. There's this idea called shadow work, which is exactly what you're describing. The idea that actually sometimes technologies produce more work rather than actually reduce work. And I think it's important to make a distinction between the actual automation of work and the displacement of work, which is effectively what's happening with something like a self-checkout, is that the work is displaced onto the unwaged customer rather than being a paid employee. So it's not automation. I don't call that automation. I think we need to sort of be very careful about that. So how do we sort of change it then? How do we change the common sense about work? My favorite way is always just to remind people about how shit work is. Most people don't like their jobs. Most people hate it. And even as an academic, a lot of the time I enjoy my job, but there's plenty of times where I'm just like, I would rather move to the countryside and do nothing. I think reminding people of that intrinsic sense of how terrible their work is, their jobs are, is useful.
Do you mind if I just butt in? I'm reminded of a story which I read about the history of labour in South Africa. So the story goes that when mineral wealth was discovered in South Africa, all these diamonds and gold deposits and stuff like that, the colonial powers realised that there was a huge opportunity here, and what they needed was a workforce to exploit this. But the local people were quite happy, because let's face it, if you've got sunshine and crops, wives and goats and a hut, then really what more do you need? So what Cecil Rhodes did was he introduced a hut tax and a goat tax that could only be paid with shillings, and the only way that you could get shillings was by selling your stuff. People didn't really want to buy it, or by going to work down the mines. And so instantly everybody is subducted into this capitalist machine. How we extract ourselves from it is another matter, isn't it?
Yeah, I think the comment the gentleman made was that we're a long way off. And I think the guys mentioned earlier on that they wouldn't want to see childcare being done by a robot. Well, that's because they're very nice guys. That may not be the case for some others. We already have, a few months ago, I went to an exhibition where what was demonstrated to me was a series of sensors that can be worn by old age pensioners, so that they can be monitored in their homes. And it had things like an algorithm which set off an alarm if they didn't move for a certain amount of time, because that might mean that they've died. And that might be seen as a useful way of doing it, but it does demonstrate there are some examples where people are looking to move into the care worker area with automation. And that's fine as long as it's alongside a human person to intervene. But I'd be more concerned if it was just a robot.
Great, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, well, I think that, firstly, Nick and Alex writing this book and bringing debates around post-work society along with like Paul Mason's work, for instance, into kind of mainstream debates, I think it's really, really important, and I'm totally with it. I mean with it isn't cool. I mean like with you. I mean, in focusing on work as something to be abolished or escaped to a certain extent, sometimes I think this is at the detriment of looking at the things that produce a society in which people can only live through selling their labour in the first place. So, without getting too kind of Marxist in this short question, separation from independent collective means to reproduce the conditions of life, basically. So, from the land, food, these kinds of issues, the fact that we meet the world through the mediating force of money and commodities. These are part and parcel of capitalist society, make capitalist society possible, but they also drive people to only be able to live by selling their labour power. Whereas, and I think sometimes that's missing from some of these debates, although the basic income, of course, allows us to have an income independent of work. But the wage, after all, itself is kind of independent of the work we do in the first place, because it kind of pays for us to be reproduced as labourers. So sometimes I think it's missing that type of connection with the kind of contributing factors towards the selling of labour power. On the other hand, and this might give you a chance to speak about another part of the book, about folk politics, a lot of those kind of folk political, as you call it, responses to kind of alternatives, delineation of alternatives, relate to food and land and kind of small-scale alternative agricultural projects, for which Bristol is quite noted, and there's a lot of stuff going on in the city along those kind of lines. They address those issues, but without addressing work. They don't tend to ever link in that to a politics of work, because of maybe the class basis of these kinds of movements, these kind of issues. So maybe I just thought you could reflect. In the book, you talk about folk politics in terms of building hegemony, political projects, but maybe in terms of what that folk political alternative offer in terms of practical interventions into how we put food on the table and that kind of thing. Thanks.
Yeah, a big question, I think.
Yeah, sorry.
let me say, I think there's really interesting experiments on sort of alternative economies and alternative ways of reproducing ourselves that don't rely upon wage labor. And you could look, not just here in Bristol, but also, in Latin America has a number of different sort of alternative economies where people have been oftentimes expelled from capitalism and are forced to survive in other ways. Now, I find all these really interesting. I think they're a really sort of useful source of ideas and experiments and alternative ways of living. But a lot of them, Bristol, somewhat of an exception, but a lot of them are survival economies. They are predominantly designed just to keep people living rather than, say, provide a sort of alluring community, a utopian idea of what the future might be. Which is why, you don't have swaths of people deciding, yeah, I want to move to these areas. They're not alluring economies in any way. They are survival economies, and I think we need to be aware of that. But yeah, it is a really difficult issue. I think the universal basic income is a sort of transitional way of reproducing ourselves outside of the wage relationship. It's, moving our sort of dependency from a private employer to a public government. And I think it's useful for that. We still have dependency. It's not a final state, but I think it gives us a lot more power to start thinking about alternative ways of reproducing ourselves that don't rely upon the whims of a boss.
Please go.
Thanks. Yeah, I was sort of reflecting on the fact that I think what you've brought together is very interesting, although it's happened over many decades. But there are problems of capitalism, problems of technology, and problems of society. And it's a question of who's in control. So capitalism wants more productivity. What it's arranged is that every piece of technological equipment is subsidized and is written off against tax allowances, sometimes 100% against profits. So it costs you almost nothing after 1 year to mechanize your workplace or your infrastructure. Now, employment, on the other hand, has been taxed. Employers hate having extra employees. They don't want twice as many half-time employees. They've positively written them out of the system throughout the recession because every employee has national insurance that the employer has to pay. So we're taxing employment, subsidizing equipment. Not surprising that supermarkets have replaced people with equipment, to give the example mentioned earlier. And at the same time, society has a problem that we then don't have income. Now, lots of people do flock to Bristol because they'd like to do really creative things, but they do have a problem finding income out of that. Luckily, there's a thriving environmental scene, art scene, creative sort of sector here. But it's not funded. Now, the universal basic income to me is a very positive thing, and it will allow people to choose shorter hours, higher quality of life, and redistribute the work. And New Economics Foundation have shown there is plenty of work around if we redistribute it. But what's happened is it's been concentrated in either elites or in very de-skilled and very insecure jobs. But that's not surprising, getting back to my first point. Surely, if we've subsidized technology, automated away the sort of creativity of it, as Mike Cooley said in the 70s when people were being laid off in the aerospace sector, they had lots of ideas. They weren't allowed to have them. They were the workforce. It was the management who wanted to control the ideas and the technology and how it was applied, how it was designed. And meanwhile, we're taxing all the jobs that are created.
Does anybody want to respond to that?
I'll make a quick comment, which is about this issue of sort of redistributing work and having a reduced working week and this sort of stuff. I think if we want to talk about, a green economy, this is absolutely essential to having a green economy. There's one study which I love, which was, it looked at the average US working week versus the average European working week. And it said that if the average average US working week was reduced to European levels, you would have a 20% savings in energy consumption, which is a huge amount of energy savings, at a, very, very easy way to do that. Rather than reinventing our entire infrastructure, which we have to do as well, but it's a long-term project, at a stroke, you could have a reduced working week and a reduced energy consumption.
Can I just also add one other thing? I think at the core of your question is taxation and how we use it best. And I think that's an entire festival of ideas of series on its own. I think Richard Murphy has recently written a book called The Joy of Tax. I'm sort of tired to hopefully it means that the content would be interesting as well. But going back to one of the questions, I think the guys are right about universal basic income does offer the opportunity to open up other avenues to pursue. So there's a lot of people in Bristol who have allotments. If they got more time to devote to those allotments, that could possibly turn into food production of some type and help to contribute to solving some of our problems. And I think robotics or automation can also help there as well. There is something, for example, there's 3D printing, and there's a movement called Maker Labs. And one of the things that Maker Labs offers up is the opportunity for people who only have a few hours available, often because they're women and they've got children to look after, and they can go off, do some design, go off to the Maker Lab, get it printed out, and get some income for that. In Noah West, there's a couple of people who are doing tapestry work, which they design, and then they can just take it to the machine and get it printed off. So there are opportunities that will be opened up as well from increasing automation.
It's on? Yeah. It's for a point of clarification, please, because you mentioned that the ideal of universal basic income is to be run in parallel with a benefit system, and I wasn't quite sure that I understood why. Is it because, for example, if someone is severely disabled, they would need more than the universal basic income, so there's a kind of supplement on top, or have I misunderstood?
Yeah, that's essentially it. The issue would be, well, you can replace some of the welfare state with the UBI. You could replace, say, pensions and some transfer payments. But other sort of aspects of the welfare state are premised upon needs-based stuff. So disabilities, childcare, seniority, all of these sorts of things, which aren't taken into account by a universal flat income. The other aspect as well, though, is something like public health care. So public health care provided by the state, much more efficient, much cheaper, much better if provided by the state rather than marketized. The idea of the libertarian sort of perspective is that you would get rid of universal health care, you would get rid of any sort of welfare state at all, and have it all done through the market, which if you look at the US is a rather miserable system to be in.
And can I just add to that? I mean, the version we were working on and are still working on didn't take away all benefits. There was still going to be, for instance, housing benefit would still be paid, and disability living allowance would still be paid. One of the things we were focused on was making sure that any individual would not be worse off under the universal basic income than they were before it was introduced. But one of the other things is we've almost got a basic income being introduced as we talk. It's called universal credit, and as the guys have pointed out, it's essentially designed to penalise people for not having a job, even when the job's not being produced.
Yeah, I think I just add to that if you look at the kind of, it's not been fully finalised, but the Finnish government is currently kind of debating various different options, and some people were trying to run some numbers on who would be penalised effectively through it. So one of them was going to be if you're a single mother with 2 children, you would effectively lose lots of money. So it would be ideal to avoid that. So these are some of the reasons why you need to think quite carefully about which benefits can be effectively replaced and which need to continue. And I think if you replace all of them with a UBI, it has various sort of bad effects.
Just a couple of observations, one and then a question. One being with universal basic income, something that was touched on, can we not expect to see more social enterprise, for example, with allotments, but also other things, more community? As people spend more time in their communities, they're more likely to get involved and help out. The other thing I don't think that was talked about with universal basic income is, should there not also be, if universal basic income is to be implemented, help with initiatives to help people use their time to their benefit? You know, that should also be a part of it. My question, and it was touched on, but not really, I'm sorry, I don't know who, but what does it mean for consumption, universal basic income, as people have more time? Does it mean they consume more? Does it mean an increase in population? And can we deal with that?
Okay, so I think to your observations, does it lead to more community, more social entrepreneurship? The studies all suggest yes. should there be help with kind of getting people to use any extra spare time they have better? I would say yes. That sounds like a good idea. What does it mean for consumption? Really good question. So one of the reasons why governments are increasingly thinking about having to introduce UBI in relationship to either automation as a phenomenon or problems with creating enough jobs is if we live in a consumer society, and more importantly a consumer economy that's based on people buying stuff in order for anybody to really make money, then people need to have the money to buy stuff, otherwise the system as a whole might well break down. So what does this mean for consumption? Yeah, excellent, very good question. So I think, at least initially, this might be designed simply to prop up consumption. So it all depends on basically who you believe on how the economy works. So if you believe the marginalist, there'll be a problem with underconsumption if you have people, if people find it harder and harder to find work, or there's less and less wages coming from work. So this would mean, yeah, you definitely would need a UBI, and the UBI would largely be to prop up consumption. Alternatively, if we believe Marx and his speculative idea, then we have a labour theory of value, so the less and less human labour that goes in, the less and less value is being created. So these will result in kind of slightly different dynamics. I mean, I think, like, what does this mean for consumption in the long run? It would be interesting to think about. Perhaps a lot of consumption can, and partly some of the reasons why we suggest this kind of combination of UBI and full automation, or more automation, is not because we actually want this as an end state, but because we're interested in getting somewhere else from this. So, in a sense, you might think that whilst governments might be encouraged to bring it in because it will prop up consumption, otherwise, the economy will start to crash, I think that there would be, for example, thinking about your observation, so more social entrepreneurship, more community, maybe people will need to consume less. Maybe this will be a way that we can kind of begin to transition away from a consumption-based economy. But a lot of this is highly speculative and depends on the exact dynamics of what happened when you reduce the amount of human labour, increase the amount of machine labour, which is hard to kind of think about fully, require sort of modelling and stuff. Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, on your second question, I'm reminded I was speaking with a Swedish designer, and she was doing a project based around sort of utopian futures and stuff. And she came up with this idea, which I thought was great, was something like replacing a job center with an activity center, and having sort of systems set up to enable people to find ways to contribute to the community, contribute to ways that are helping people, helping society, rather than just sort of forcing them back into a job. And I think that's sort of an interesting idea. On the consumption thing, I'll just make a quick comment, which is, right now, when we have a productivity enhancement in technology, there's two sort of options that can be done with it. One is produce more goods with the same amount of labor. The other option is to produce the same amount of goods with a reduced labor. Post-work fundamentally chooses the second option. And so I think it's a reduced production of goods in a way that is more environmentally sustainable rather than just constantly expanding consumption and production.
Hi.
Well, just if I can comment, I think if the assumption is that we're going to increase consumption, we're going to have to increase production potentially to be able to deliver that. And if the premise is that all of this is going to be automated, that means you need more robots. And the companies that are making those robots are going to need more people to service them. Think of the Genius Bar for Apple. They actually have a whole infrastructure of people around the technology to sustain it. It means you're going to need more salespeople. So I don't see at what point you don't increase actually the number of jobs that are needed to deliver the consumption that we'd be asking for given this basic income.
I mean, I think the issue really is in the sort of aggregate terms rather than sort of individual industries. I think if we look at, say for instance, the most popular job in the United States right now is truck drivers. And truck drivers are at risk of automation. So that's, millions of jobs that could potentially be gone in the United States. Now, there's obviously going to be new jobs that sort of arise with new technologies. But I'm trying to remember the exact stats. It's something along the lines of 0.5% of people are working in industries that are less than like 20 years old. The new industries that are coming on board are not generally job-creating industries. And this is really sort of the problematic aspect. You can point to Instagram, you can point to Facebook as having small workforces, but those are sort of single examples. On a general level, the industry itself, though, still doesn't produce many jobs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's interesting because at least in the robotics community, people are very mindful of this need to not replace people. And so most of the robots that are being developed now are really robots that are cobots, so collaborative robots that are built to work alongside humans, either on the assembly line, and there you would have a human teaching the robot, and the robot would do the repetitive tasks. And actually in the autonomous car field, it looks like it will be tricky to just give a fully autonomous car to people and have that drive all the roads. The model right now is to have the driver in the loop, and actually that's a tricky thing because sometimes the driver's driving and sometimes he's not, but to actually have that where the system is in symbiosis and you're really working with the human and with the robot. So in terms of the things that people are developing now, it's very much, a collaboration and not a direct replacement. So that's something to think about.
Just to clarify you guys' position, your post-work position is in favor of full automation.
A full automation.
Or as much automation as we can usefully introduce, I think. So, and certainly in terms of kind of working alongside robots, in terms of robots doing the kind of boring, dirty, unpleasant work. I mean, this is something which we absolutely advocate and would find very interesting to think about how you would sort of engineer these systems to kind of support rather than totally replace work. Yes.
Thanks very much, everyone, but I'd like to challenge the very idea of basic income, because either it seems to me to be going too far, because it would be obviously very hard to implement universally, and Darian earlier posed a question about who is included in the universal income, children, robots, etc. So it'd be very, very hard to implement, but it's not going far enough, because it does nothing, as far as I can see, to challenge the basic problem of capitalism, which has nothing to do with automation, which is extremely high levels of inequality, and if, as Marx might have put it, ownership of the means of production. And if basic income is a good idea today in times of automation, then it was a good idea 100 years ago when women, actually, as well as men, were working 12 hours a day at incredibly boring jobs in factories. It was if anything, it was a more important idea then than it is now. So that's one point in challenge of the idea of basic income. But also, you can think of it now. You're talking about a fully automated world. So income is a phrase that's used to, as a reward. We don't even need to know Marx to know this. It's a reward for work. So why are we using the term income at all when we're talking about a society where people are not working? Who's going to be working? The creatures working will be the robots. So are they the ones who will be generating the tax out of which this basic income will be generated? And then are they entitled to a basic income? And then there's the point that was made at the end of the table. Are they going to then ask for another robot to do the jobs that they're doing that they may decide they don't like doing very much? And so we get kind of an infinite regress here. So it seems to me that from two directions, basic income is not Marxist enough, it's not socialist enough, and on the other hand, it would be almost impossible in the existing capitalist world to implement. I mean, Finland's finding it hard enough. So if one country finds it hard enough, how on earth, with all the refugees, with all the people who are not citizens, displaced persons in the world, all the other problems in the world, how on earth and why are we going for something that is so difficult to implement, but is not a fully, to talk from a Marxist perspective, socialist solution, where we don't bother about wages at all, and we have everyone owning the means of production?
I thought that was, excellent questions. On the issue about sort of the limits of where would UBI be applied, we prefer the idea of a universal basic income precisely because it compels any sort of limits to be temporary. And I think the ideal would be a global basic income, whether it be carried out by some sort of international institution or whether it be a series of international transfers. We can imagine different ways. That being said, I think as a viable future, we have to be thinking it in terms of the nation state, unfortunately. I think it's problematic in numerous ways, precisely because of everything you pointed out. Now, that being said, I think the sort of ideal situation that's at least viable and imaginable now is what Alaska has, which as far as I know, is if you live in Alaska for 6 months, you can get access to their basic income. You don't have to be a citizen, which I think is really problematic. I think it's going to take me like 10 years to become a citizen here. I want my basic income now. So I think Alaska is a nice model, living someplace for 6 months. Now, there's still a lot of problematic categories, displaced peoples, refugees. These are huge issues and very, very important issues. I don't have an easy answer to them, unfortunately. But it is something absolutely to raise and to be pressing on. It's not full communism, you're right. So the second sort of aspect, it doesn't go far enough. Yes, I think the question is not, is this the end point? The question is, how do we get to a sort of end point which is much better? I'm of the opinion that we don't know what communism or something after capitalism would actually look like. We don't know what to replace the market with. We don't know how to sort of redistribute labor in a meaningful way yet. We don't know how to do some sort of economic planning, whether it be central or decentral. And we don't know what a sort of economic system that's not based upon accumulation would look like. I think something like a post-work society, which would still be capitalist, the ideas that we argue for, we're still in a capitalist society, enable us to have a space, first of all, the time, to actually start thinking about these things. So a lot of people who do political activism, myself included, I come home from work and there's some sort of activist meeting, and I'm like, oh, that sounds great, but I'm just so exhausted. I think a post-work society enables us to start really working together and gives us the space, time, the mental freedom to be able to do these sorts of things. It also liberates us from the coercion of labor, the coercion of work, which I think is a crucial aspect of a post-work society, to then start building upon that, to build towards something further. I don't know what it would be yet, but it's at least a transitional step, I think.
Yeah, I think you raised some very important questions about the difficulty of implementing it. I know in our situation we looked at it very with great degree of work, and I think at one point we decided it would be for all those resident in the UK for at least a year, or children that were born here. But then we also would need to make it payable. The citizens' pension section, for instance, would need to be payable to early-age pensioners who were living overseas, which was about 3 to 5 million, I think we worked at some point. So yeah, I echo the other comments. It's a means to something else. It's not the end product. It's getting towards something else where we actually do get towards a system where people know they're going to get a decent income, even if it's a basic income, whereas the current situation is there's a lot of people in this country who are not getting anything at all.
So I think on that note, we're going to have to bring it to a close. But there are many people whose questions didn't get answered. I saw many hands. And so this conversation will continue, and I will mention one place in particular where it will continue. That's on the 21st of January. The Bristol and Bath branch of the British Science Association is hosting another meeting, another debate on robotics and the future. Sabine will be there, yes? It will be at Hamilton House in Stokes Croft. So you can visit the webpage of the British Science Association Bristol and Bath branch and get more details about that. And let me thank very much all of our panelists, and also Miguel for nicely chairing the discussion section of the event. And thank you all for your questions. Thanks.